think just a great place to start would be a short kind of career journey of how you went from being a Morgan Stanley intern at 17 in high school to securing your position now, and kind of how you got there and why you chose Morgan Stanley.
Yeah, it's a little bit of it's a great question, Caroline. I'm a kid from Chicago, born and raised, one of three boys, middle kid. Shout out to all the middle kids that are out there. You know, the struggle is real. I stumbled upon, frankly, the internship opportunity. I had no interest really in finance. I thought I'd be an educator when I was a young kid, like a lot of us. We tend to be influenced by key figures in our community, and I had a lot of teachers who were in mind. But this internship, which fulfilled a high school requirement, uh, uh, working 20 hours a week, making $5 an hour. It was a very transactional thing, but like a lot of things, when you start to get exposure to something, your curiosity, particularly when you're at that age, your curiosity starts to grow. And my life circumstances were such where I needed to work and I needed the money. And so anyway, through the exposure, right, which is, I think, one of the most powerful things for young people to receive, right? It's not enough to get educated. It's not enough to just simply say work hard. So effort is obviously important, but the exposure piece was a big deal for me. So once I started, then this whole ecosystem of financial services, which we loosely call Wall Street, sort of opened up to me. So the first big move was getting the internship. The second big move was moving to New York when I was 24 years old. So I'd finished my undergrad studies. And then I've just been fortunate, Caroline, to get opportunities across the ecosystem doing very different things. And we can unpack how that came to fruition. But I've been fortunate to have mentors and sponsors along the way that have created some tailwinds, but it's been a great ride.
I guess even dovetailing off that, just really quick, we actually had just a talk with someone, and he actually mentioned what I thought was really poignant, that everyone is actually lucky in their own way, and yours in a sense was that first internship that you had. But he said the key is that the successful people take advantage of their luck as opposed to just being passive with that luck. And I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
No, 100%. I mean, I think it's one thing to whether it's you put yourself in a position to take advantage of a particular opportunity, or you just happen to be fortunate to have a network or have a family where an opportunity presents itself. But in the final analysis, you've got to take advantage of the opportunity, right? And you've got to be I don't know if it's in the right, I don't want to say right state of mind, right framework, et cetera, but you need to be able to recognize when they present themselves and then know how to lean in. It's similar to that old adage of the harder I work, the luckier I get, right? So again, it's all about putting yourself in position to have some optionality, which again is always a good thing. But to your point, Brett, it's one thing to get the look. It's another thing to take full advantage of that look. So it's a really good point.
So I really like what you said there about the taking advantage of the luck. In terms of the cultural shift from the west side of Chicago to New York, as I said, like I traveled internationally. I moved because of my dad's job, and I know how hard it is to make those cultural shifts. So could you just speak a bit about what that shift was like, and any advice you would have maybe for students who might experience such a shift, whether it's in high school and college, just throughout their life, or through their professional career?
Life and careers are circuitous. I mean, they're we tend to think of them in a linear sort of context, but they're journeys, and those journeys are full of what I'll call a series of J curves. And the J curve comes whenever you take risk, right? So moving from Chicago to New York, that doesn't happen if I don't muster up the courage to say, I'm going to leave everything that was familiar to me. Caroline, your story, being a citizen of the world, literally, crossing, country borders, different cultures, and basically, trusting that you can adapt and assimilate, wherever you are. Like that's not an easy thing. And so on some level, which never really gets talked about when it comes to building a successful career, is just how much suffering you have to endure. Right. And so that was my point about the J curve. So when I left Chicago, Chicago is a big city, 4 million people. New York has double that number, and then some, and it moves a bit faster. So going from the Midwest to the East Coast, I mean, it took a little bit of time for me to get comfortable with the speed of New York. But like anything, if you want to get better, right, you have to embrace getting uncomfortable. So when you says take risk, that also means, or translation is, hey, I'm going to be a little uncomfortable, and you've got to have the resiliency to endure that part of the curve when you feel like, okay, maybe I made a bad decision. You're staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. At some point you hit rock bottom, but then your confidence starts to build. You start to manage your insecurities a little bit better. And then all of a sudden you're now starting to progress. And now you fully understand and appreciate, okay, this is why I made the move. But to me, the thing that separates those who end up having some success versus not is there's some folks who don't even jump in the pool, right? They don't even make the decision to take the risk because in their minds, they're already sort of talking themselves out of, well, here's why this won't work, that won't work. But if you want to be great, you've got to be comfortable getting uncomfortable.
And I think even that's, and then just so the audience can understand too, J curves are usually kind of a bit of a dip, and then you kind of can progress up to the next level. I guess one thing in there that you mentioned too is the suffering. So it is actually not just taking that risk or that leap, but it's also being able to push through that little dip before you can actually make the progress and not, losing the confidence in yourself as you're inevitably gonna not be as successful in a new environment as you've known a familiar one.
Brett and Caroline, I would say there are 3 things all successful people have, in my view. One is you have to have a high degree of self-confidence. And that's not cockiness, right? Cockiness is you're projecting, but there's no substance underneath. Confidence is you're actually putting in the work, to develop yourself, develop your mind, etc. But you've got a belief system that, hey, I am good enough, I belong. I may not know as much as some of the folks around me, but in due time, I will catch up, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to have a high degree of self-confidence. You've got to be able to manage your insecurities. And that's a bit of a paradox that people don't, I think, fully appreciate as it relates to this journey of life and a career is we all have insecurities. We all have these moments where we second guess ourselves, but ultimately a part of the whole pushing through and being able to suffer through is the ability to manage it, to recognize it and to manage it. And then thirdly, it's so important to have impulse control. Because again, when those tough days come, right, Caroline, I'm sure as you made moves in your life or what have you, there were moments where, why did I move here? And there's this, you can get a little impulsive to say, it's time to go home. But you've got to be able to, again, press through that, get on the other side of that for you to actually start to see the benefits of taking on the risk in the first place.
In your view on whether you think that hustle is ingrained from birth, like the way you were raised by parents, grandparents, whoever, or if it's something that you learn based on if you're pursuing something you're passionate about, or just where that energy and effort and hustle comes from.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And the nature nurture dynamic, like with most things, it's this theoretical or philosophical debate that I don't know if I have the answer. I think that there were elements of my grandparents and watching and observing them that probably bled into my subconscious. But there are very specific things I can point to in high school. Like I fancied myself as an athlete, but I just didn't work hard enough. Right? I didn't want to burn the calories, right, that were required to be as good of a basketball player as I probably could have been. So there are clear examples of where the hustle, I didn't apply it to something that, frankly, I was interested in. But I like to think about, Malcolm Gladwell, who published obviously many books, but one that is one of my favorites is Outliers. And in Outliers, he talks about the 10,000 hour rule. And I think to be great, right, whether you are, as he talks about in the books, to be the Beatles, Steve Jobs, or if you want to be Steph Curry, right, there's no way around it than working extremely hard. Now, I think the key, for folks that may be watching this interview is the secret sauce is being really interested in it, right? When you are really interested in something, right, that's kind of the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning. Then so think about this as a Venn diagram. So there's that, right? Really interested in the work, right? The second Venn circle of the Venn diagram is you're wired to do it, right? It aligns to your superpower, your slice of genius. And then the third circle is there's actually a market for it, right? You can monetize it. So you want to be really interested in it. It has to align to what you're really good at. And then there's a market for it. And the reason that I emphasize the Venn diagram is because back to this point about being able to suffer, there's this idea of if I'm doing what I love and if I'm doing what I'm best at, then I can actually suffer longer than anyone else, right? Like in the key to success, in my mind, at least in terms of living your best life, is to work really, really hard at the things that come easy to you. And if you could somehow figure out how to crack that code, right? That to me, so it's not just the spoils of success, but you're also happy, right? Which I think is a very important, part of the process. So that Venn diagram, am I interested in it? Does it align to my superpowers or my slice of genius? And is there a real market for it? So whether I'm an employee or I'm going to be a founder of my own company, I still think the Venn diagram holds.
And I guess even off of that, right? I read a quote somewhere. I actually think it was Matthew McConaughey, oddly enough, but he said that the people make the mistake of pursuing happiness because happiness is you're always on a different mountain.
Totally.
Even the actual happiness comes from the pursuit of joy. And it's that act, it's the verb that makes people happy, not the noun. And people kind of make that mistake all the time.
So Brett, I've heard that exact same. I'm a big Matthew McConaughey fan. I've listened to, I think it was a graduation speech at the University of Texas, maybe, which I know he's an alum, but he talks about, we have this if-then dynamic with happiness. If I do this, if I get, in his context, if I get the awards and the box office accolades, then I'll be happy. But life, back to the J-curve piece, life is a series of J-curves, or life is a series of seasons, right? You have your summer, your spring, your spring, summer, fall, but we all go through a winter from time to time. So you can't have this conditional thing that if I get to this level of success, then I'll be happy. To your point, he talked about joy, right? Like just joy is a completely different thing. And I'm a big believer that if you get to that place, life becomes so much easier and so much more enjoyable, to state the obvious.
And I think the J-curve analogy works really well, because one thing I'd love to touch on too is, I mean, your career has been quite a few J-curves, and especially the kind of dynamic ones at that. How do you though kind of recognize when you're at the top of that J-curve, and then how do you know, because each J-curve is kind of is a separation from the other one, that you can make that leap and that you feel, obviously you're not going to feel like you said 100% confident, but that that's your kind of next.
In some ways, this is the serendipity of life, where you actually don't get to control the timing. Like it's never as elegant, and transitions aren't initially presented to you in a nice box. So for example, just when you start to get to the top of the J-curve and you're starting to feel like in my case, I have started to master my craft and start to feel like I'm really good at running marketing for the firm. And just as I get my legs underneath me, then there's this other opportunity that presents itself that I'm also interested in, even though I know that it's going to create some personal breakage in making the pivot. But then you have to ask yourself, it's like, all right, in terms of the future state, will I be a better athlete for taking this risk on? and pursuing this thing, even though I'm really comfortable here. And this gets back to your point earlier about risk taking and your mindset. And there's a lot of folks who get content, and when that next opportunity presents itself, they are less inclined to do it. I'm just wired a little different, where I guess I'm a glutton for punishment on some level. But I do think the most important message, I think, in the question for folks is the timing never quite works out in an ideal way. So when that proverbial knock at the door takes place, when it's time to move, it's time to relocate, et cetera, again, it gets back to the suffering. It gets back to some scar tissue, right? It's not for the faint of heart. It's not easy. But, if you ask yourself the question, okay, if I do this on the other side of it, will I be better for it? And that's sort of been my guiding principle in making the up-down decisions on things as they presented themselves to me.